The computer screen flickered with drone surveillance footage as Captain Raven Sinclair adjusted her headset for the 100th time that morning. Her flight suit hung pristine and unworn in the locker behind her, a daily reminder of the cockpit she hadn't seen in 8 months. Another day of watching real pilots fly real missions while she guided unmanned aircraft from a climate-controlled trailer. Another day of being completely invisible to everyone who mattered in the sky. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning briefing at Kandahar Airfield had ended 20 minutes ago, and Raven wasn't invited. She never was. The real pilots, the ones who flew a 10 Thunderbolts and F-16 fighting Falcons into actual combat, gathered in the main operations center while she remained in the remote piloted aircraft trailer, monitoring feeds from Predator drones that others controlled from thousands of miles away. Her job was simple: watch the screens, log the data, and file reports that nobody would read. Staff Sergeant Nicole Hayes knocked on the trailer door before entering, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the sympathetic expression that had become all too familiar. "Morning, Captain. Thought you might need this." She handed Raven the steaming cup, then glanced at the bank of monitors displaying various aerial perspectives of the Afghan countryside. "Thanks, Hose." Raven accepted the coffee gratefully. Nicole was one of the few people on base who treated her like an actual pilot instead of glorified office equipment. "Anything interesting happening in the real world today?" Nicole settled into the chair beside her, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Operation Crimson Dawn got the green light. Colonel Burke is sending 2 squadrons into Helmand Province to hit those supply routes intelligence has been tracking." She paused, studying Raven's expression. "Word is they're expecting heavy resistance." Raven's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She'd read the same intelligence reports, studied the same satellite imagery, analyzed the same target assessments. In fact, she'd written half of the tactical recommendations that Burke's pilots would be following. But her name wouldn't appear on any mission roster, and her voice wouldn't crackle over any combat frequency. She was a desk pilot, a former combat aviator relegated to pushing pixels instead of pushing the envelope. "Who's leading the strike?" Raven asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Captain Carter is taking Alpha Squadron, and Lieutenant Anderson has Bravo. They're flying at 10s with full ordnance loads." Nicole hesitated. "Burke specifically requested Carter for mission command. Captain Luke Venom Carter. The poster boy for aggressive flying and tactical shortcuts." Raven had watched him brief missions with the kind of swagger that came from never having encountered a problem he couldn't solve with more firepower and faster flying. He was good, she'd give him that, but he was also reckless in ways that made her pilot instincts scream warnings that nobody wanted to hear. The trailer door opened again, interrupting her thoughts. Major Tom Eagle Foster stepped inside, his weathered face bearing the kind of lines that came from 20 years of squinting into hostile skies. Unlike most of the other pilots, Foster had actually flown combat missions when aircraft were simpler and enemies were more predictable. He commanded a grudging respect from the younger pilots, though he rarely exercised it on anyone's behalf. "Sinclair," he said with a curt nod. "Burke wants updated imagery on the target zone. Your drones have been monitoring the area longer than anyone else." Raven pulled up the relevant files on her primary monitor, highlighting the terrain features and infrastructure. That would matter most to the attacking aircraft. "The supply depot is here," she said, pointing to a cluster of buildings nestled against a rocky outcropping. "But look at this ridgeline to the east. Perfect placement for mobile SAM sites, and we've detected intermittent electromagnetic signatures. That suggests they're moving equipment in and out." Foster leaned closer, studying the imagery with professional interest. "You think they're setting a trap?" "I think they know we're coming," Raven replied carefully. The supply convoys have changed their patterns twice in the last week, and that usually means they're either expecting visitors or preparing to relocate. If I were planning the defense, I'd let us commit to the attack run and then light us up from multiple positions when we're focused on the primary target. Interesting theory. Foster straightened up, his expression unreadable. You planning to share that assessment with the mission planners? The question hung in the air like smoke from a damaged engine. They both knew that Raven's tactical insights carried exactly as much weight as her opinions on the base cafeteria menu. She was a desk pilot, a former combat aviator whose experience had been administratively invalidated by a medical review board that found her unsuitable for high-stress combat operations after a single incident that had nothing to do with her flying ability. I'm sure Captain Carter has his own assessment of the tactical situation, Raven said diplomatically. Foster grunted something that might have been agreement or disgust, then turned to leave. At the doorway, he paused and looked back. For what it's worth, Sinclair, some of us remember when you were the best stick and rudder pilot in the squadron. Politics and paperwork don't change that. After he left, Nicole whistled softly. That's the closest thing to a compliment I've ever heard Foster give anyone. Raven turned back to her monitors, where the drone feeds continued their monotonous surveillance of terrain that would soon be crawling with surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft artillery. She could see the tactical picture with crystal clarity, the likely ambush points, the escape routes, the vulnerabilities that the attacking pilots would need to avoid. But she was just a desk pilot now, relegated to watching other people fly into danger she could see coming from miles away. Her flight suit hung in the locker behind her, unworn and pristine. The A-10 Thunderbolt she'd once called Warthog 6 was sitting on the flight line right now, being prepped for a mission she wasn't cleared to fly. Somewhere in the main operations center, pilots half her age were reviewing target folders and weather reports while she monitored drone feeds and filed digital paperwork. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd been grounded for being unsuitable for high-stress combat operations. Yet here she was, watching those same operations unfold through electronic eyes, seeing patterns and threats that the actual combat pilots might miss. Her experience was valuable enough to guide remote surveillance, but not valuable enough to trust with actual flight controls. Raven sipped her coffee and watched the screens flicker with images of empty roads and quiet buildings. In a few hours, those roads would be filled with smoke and those buildings would be rubble. Young pilots would fly into harm's way, carrying her intelligence reports and following flight paths she'd helped plan. They'd face enemies positioned exactly where her analysis predicted they'd be, and she'd watch it all happen from a climate-controlled trailer, wearing a flight suit that hadn't felt the rush of actual flight in 8 months, being completely invisible to everyone who mattered in the sky. The morning sun climbed higher over Kandahar Airfield, casting long shadows across the flight line where real pilots prepared for real missions. Captain Raven Sinclair adjusted her headset again and returned to monitoring feeds from aircraft she'd never fly, preparing reports that others would use to fly missions she'd never be cleared for, watching the war through electronic eyes while her own experience gathered dust in classified personnel files. She had no idea that in less than 12 hours, everything would change. That the mission she was watching unfold would go catastrophically wrong in exactly the way she'd predicted. That the pilots who dismissed her warnings would find themselves trapped in enemy territory with no way out and no hope of rescue. And that the desk pilot everyone had forgotten would be their only chance of coming home alive. The main operations center buzzed with pre-mission energy when Raven finally worked up the courage to approach Colonel Harrison Burke's office. Through the glass partition, she could see him reviewing flight plans with Captain Carter and Lieutenant Anderson, their heads bent over tactical displays that showed the same terrain she'd been analyzing for weeks. Her intelligence reports were spread across the conference table, annotated with notes she couldn't read from this distance. She knocked twice and waited for Burke's gruff enter before stepping inside. The conversation stopped immediately, 3 pairs of eyes turning toward her with expressions ranging from mild annoyance to outright dismissal. Burke's office always felt smaller when occupied by actual pilots, their presence somehow diminishing the space available for anyone else. "Captain Sinclair," Burke said without looking up from the mission folder. "I assume this is about your drone surveillance reports. They've been noted and filed appropriately. Sir, I wanted to discuss some tactical concerns about the target zone." Raven kept her voice steady and professional, despite the way Carter was already smirking at something. Anderson had whispered, "The electromagnetic signatures I've been tracking suggest—" "Captain," Burke interrupted, finally looking up with the kind of tired patience normally reserved for explaining obvious concepts to slow children. "Your job is to monitor drone feeds and compile surveillance data. The tactical planning is handled by qualified combat pilots." The word qualified hung in the air like a challenge. Everyone in the room knew her history, knew about the medical review board, knew about the psychological evaluation that had deemed her unsuitable for high-stress combat operations. It didn't matter that she'd flown more combat sorties than Carter and Anderson combined. It didn't matter that her tactical recommendations had saved lives on previous missions. All that mattered was the stamp in her personnel file that relegated her to desk duty. Carter leaned back in his chair, his flight suit crisp and bearing all the patches that marked him as an active combat pilot. "With respect, Colonel, maybe we should hear what Desk Pilot Sinclair has to say. Might be entertaining." The nickname hit like a physical blow. Desk pilot, the kind of casual cruelty that reduced 8 years of combat experience to a punchline. Raven had heard it whispered in the corridors, seen it written on duty rosters as an unofficial call sign. It was meant to sting, and it did. "The SAM sites along the eastern ridgeline," she continued, ignoring Carter's smirk. "They're not static installations. The electromagnetic patterns show them moving every 6 to 8 hours, which means they're mobile launchers designed to create overlapping fields of fire. If you approach from the standard attack vector, the standard attack vector has been used successfully in this theater for the past 18 months. Anderson interrupted. His voice carried the kind of confidence that came from flying missions. "Without encountering serious opposition. We're not exactly reinventing warfare here." Burke nodded agreement, closing the mission folder with finality. "The flight plan has been approved by Squadron Command and reviewed by intelligence. Your drone data is valuable, Sinclair, but tactical decision-making requires a different kind of experience." The dismissal was complete, wrapped in language. That sounded official but felt personal. Raven's hands clenched involuntarily at her sides, a habit left over from years of gripping control sticks under pressure. She'd sat in countless briefings like this one, back when her opinions mattered, when other pilots listened to her insights instead of treating them like interesting curiosities. "Sir, if I could just show you the pattern analysis," she tried. "Once more, Captain Sinclair." Burke's voice carried a warning edge now. "You're not cleared for this mission. You're not qualified for tactical planning. And you're certainly not in a position to second-guess pilots who are actually going to be flying these aircraft." He gestured toward Carter and Anderson. "These men have logged hundreds of combat hours in current theater conditions. Your experience is ... dated." Dated, another carefully chosen word that somehow managed to be both technically accurate and personally devastating. Her combat experience was dated 8 months old, to be precise. 8 months since the incident that had ended her flying career and begun her exile to climate-controlled trailers and computer screens. Carter stood up, his movement casual but pointed. "Maybe you should stick to what you know, desk pilot. Leave the real flying to the real pilots." He gathered his flight plan materials, making sure to shuffle them unnecessarily loudly. "We've got a mission to prep for." As the three men filed out of the office, Raven caught fragments of their conversation. Something about armchair quarterbacking and Monday morning quarterbacking from someone who hasn't pulled G's in months. Their laughter echoed down the corridor, the kind of easy camaraderie shared by people who belong to an exclusive club. She was no longer invited to join. Alone in Burke's office, Raven stared at the tactical display still showing the target zone, the same ridgeline she'd been studying, the same electromagnetic signatures that screamed ambush to anyone with enough experience to read them, the same terrain features that would turn a routine strike mission into a deadly trap for pilots too confident to listen to warnings from a desk pilot. She walked back to her trailer slowly, passing the flight line where ground crews were loading ordnance onto a 10 Thunderbolts. Her old aircraft Warthog 6 sat among them, its nose art freshly painted and its engines already running warm-up cycles. Someone else would be flying it today. Someone else would feel the familiar vibration of its massive GA-U-8 cannon, experience the satisfaction of bringing 30,000 pounds of armored destruction to bear against enemy targets. Nicole was waiting in the trailer with another cup of coffee and the kind of sympathetic expression that made everything worse. "How did it go?" "About as expected," Raven replied, settling back into her chair among the drone monitors. "Desk pilots don't get to play with the big boys." "Their loss," Nicole said loyally. "You've forgotten more about air-to-ground tactics than Carter will ever know." The sentiment was kind but irrelevant. In a military structure built on rank and qualification, past experience meant nothing if it wasn't backed by current certification. Raven's 8 years of combat flying had been erased by a single psychological evaluation, her tactical expertise reduced to surveillance data and filed reports. On the monitors, the drone feeds showed the same empty terrain that would soon be filled with aircraft and explosions, the same ridgelines that concealed mobile SAM sites, the same kill zones that confident pilots would fly into because they'd stopped listening to warnings from desk pilots. Raven adjusted her headset and began typing her final surveillance report, documenting everything she'd observed about enemy movements and defensive preparations. Someone would read it eventually, probably after the mission was complete and the lessons had been learned the hard way. She had no authority to stop the mission, no clearance to fly support, no voice in tactical decisions that could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. She was just a desk pilot now, watching real pilots prepare for real dangers while her own experience gathered dust in personnel files marked unsuitable for high-stress combat operations. In 6 hours, Operation Crimson Dawn would launch according to the flight plan she'd tried to critique. Carter and Anderson would lead their squadrons into the same trap she'd identified, following the same attack vector she'd warned against, and Captain Raven Sinclair would watch it all unfold through electronic eyes, powerless to intervene, invisible to everyone who mattered in the sky. The main briefing room filled with the controlled chaos that preceded every major operation. Pilots clustered around coffee stations and tactical displays, their conversations a mixture of technical jargon and gallows humor that masked the tension. Everyone felt but nobody acknowledged. Raven stood near the back wall, technically present but practically invisible, holding a tablet loaded with her surveillance data that nobody had requested. Colonel Burke strode to the front of the room with the bearing of a man accustomed to having his orders followed without question. The conversations died immediately, replaced by the rustle of flight suits and the scrape of chairs as 24 pilots settled into their seats. Raven remained standing, excluded from the inner circle by protocols that nobody needed to explain. "Gentlemen," Burke began, his voice carrying easily through the briefing room. "Operation Crimson Dawn is a go. Weather conditions are optimal, intelligence indicates minimal air defenses, and target verification is solid." He clicked a remote, and the main display screen illuminated with satellite imagery of the Helmand Province target zone. The same imagery. Raven had been studying for weeks. The same ridgelines where she detected mobile SAM movements. The same terrain features that screamed ambush to anyone with enough experience to recognize the patterns. She shifted uncomfortably, her tablet growing heavy in her hands as she watched. Burke highlight attack vectors that would funnel the aircraft directly into overlapping fields of fire. Captain Carter stood and moved to the display, a laser pointer, materializing in his hand like a magician's prop. Alpha Squadron will approach from the northwest, using the valley terrain to mask our approach until we're within strike range of the primary target. He traced a red line across the screen, the beam dancing over exactly the route Raven had identified as most vulnerable to ground-based air defenses. Bravo Squadron comes in from the southwest 30 seconds later. Lieutenant Anderson added, joining Carter at the front of the room. We'll hit the secondary targets while Alpha engages the main supply depot. Clean and simple in and out before they know what hit them. The plan was textbook perfect for a conventional attack against static defenses. Unfortunately, Raven's intelligence indicated that nothing about this target was conventional or static. The electromagnetic signatures she'd been tracking showed a sophisticated defense network that had been preparing for exactly this type of assault. Mobile SAM launchers that could reposition between surveillance passes. Communications gear that suggested coordination between multiple defensive positions. Supply convoy patterns that indicated the enemy knew they were being watched. Burke clicked to the next slide, showing expected opposition and threat assessments. Intelligence reports. Minimal surface-to-air capability. Some small arms fire, possibly a few RPGs, but nothing that should challenge our aircraft. Flight time to target is 47 minutes each way, with approximately 15 minutes on station for target engagement. Raven bit her lip to keep from speaking. The intelligence reports Burke was referencing were weeks old, compiled before she'd started detecting the electromagnetic signatures that indicated a much more sophisticated defensive network. Her more recent surveillance data painted a completely different picture, but it remained buried in her tablet while outdated assessments drove tactical planning. Major Foster raised his hand from the middle of the room. What about escape and evasion protocols? If someone goes down in that terrain, recovery could be complicated. SAR assets are on standby, Burke replied. But based on current threat assessment, we're not expecting any aircraft losses. This should be a routine strike mission. Routine. The word made Raven's stomach clench. In her experience, the missions that looked routine were often the ones that went catastrophically wrong. Overconfidence was a pilot killer, and she could feel it saturating the briefing room like aviation fuel vapors waiting for a spark. Carter clicked to a detailed view of the target area, his laser pointer highlighting specific buildings and infrastructure. Primary target is the supply depot complex here. Secondary targets include these vehicle staging areas and what appears to be a communications facility. We go in fast, hit hard, and get out before they can organize any meaningful response. From her position near the back wall, Raven could see the tactical problem with crystal clarity. The target complex was positioned in a natural bowl surrounded by elevated terrain, perfect for concealing defensive positions that could engage aircraft during their attack runs. The approach routes Carter had selected would require the A-10s to fly directly through multiple potential ambush zones, with limited maneuvering room if they encountered unexpected opposition. Any questions? Burke asked, scanning the room with the confident expression of a commander who expected none. Several hands went up with routine queries about fuel loads, ordnance configurations, and communication protocols. Standard pre-mission questions that addressed mechanical details while ignoring the strategic picture. Nobody asked about the electromagnetic signatures. Nobody questioned the age of the intelligence reports. Nobody wondered why a target this important had been left undefended for so long. Raven's hand started to rise involuntarily, her body responding to years of training that demanded she speak up when she saw tactical problems. But she caught herself. Halfway, remembering Burke's earlier dismissal, Carter's mocking tone, the reality of her current status as a desk pilot whose opinions carried no weight in operational planning. "Outstanding," Burke said, interpreting the silence as confirmation rather than resignation. "Final briefing for flight crews is at 1400 hours. Mission launch at 1600. Let's make this one count, gentlemen." The room erupted into motion as pilots gathered their materials and headed toward their respective squadron areas. Conversations resumed, but with the focused intensity that preceded combat operations. Flight suits rustled, boots echoed on concrete floors, and the familiar pre-mission energy filled the space like electricity before a thunderstorm. Raven remained against the back wall, watching the exodus of pilots who would soon be flying into a trap she could see coming, but couldn't prevent. Her tablet contained surveillance data that might save their lives, but nobody had asked for it, and nobody would listen if she tried to share it unsolicited. Carter paused near the door, his eyes finding hers across the emptying briefing room. "Something wrong, desk pilot? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just reviewing the surveillance data," she replied carefully, lifting her tablet slightly. "Making sure everything's documented properly." "Good girl," Carter said with condescending approval. "That's what you're here for. Leave the flying to us." As the last pilot left the briefing room, Raven stood alone among empty chairs and abandoned coffee cups. The tactical display still showed the target area, Carter's laser pointer trails fading from the screen like contrails dissipating in clear sky. The same terrain that would soon be filled with aircraft and explosions. The same kill zones that confident pilots would enter, because they dismissed warnings from someone they considered irrelevant. She looked down at her tablet, its screen filled with electromagnetic analysis and threat assessments that painted a picture completely different from the one Burke had presented. Data that suggested Operation Crimson Dawn was flying into a carefully prepared ambush. Intelligence that might mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. But she was just a desk pilot now, relegated to watching other people make decisions based on outdated information and institutional overconfidence. Her warnings had been dismissed, her expertise discounted, her voice silenced by protocols that valued current certification over combat experience. In 3 hours, 24 pilots would climb into their aircraft and fly toward a target zone, where enemies waited with weapons designed to turn air superiority fighters into burning wreckage. And Captain Raven Sinclair would watch it all happen through drone feeds, powerless to intervene, invisible to everyone who mattered in the sky. The first indication of trouble came exactly where Raven had predicted it would. She was monitoring multiple drone feeds from her trailer when Alpha Squadron crossed into Helmand Province airspace. There are 10 Thunderbolts maintaining perfect formation as they approached the target zone. The electromagnetic spectrum analyzer beside her primary monitor had been quiet for the past hour, but suddenly erupted with activity as multiple radar signatures painted the incoming aircraft. "Contact! Contact! Contact!" Carter's voice crackled. Through the communication system, his earlier confidence replaced by sharp urgency. Multiple SAM sites active, bearing 090 through 120. They've got a solid lock on Alpha lead. Raven's fingers flew across her console, switching between drone cameras to get visual confirmation of what her electronic sensors were already screaming. The ridgeline she'd identified weeks ago was alive with missile launches, bright flashes, erupting from concealed positions that had remained invisible until the aircraft were well within their engagement envelope. Mobile SAM launchers that had spent days positioning themselves for exactly this moment. "Alpha 2, break right." Carter's transmission was strained now, the casual swagger completely gone. "SAM in the air, SAM in the air. They're everywhere." On Raven's screen, she could see the white contrails of surface-to-air missiles arcing toward the A-10s like deadly fireworks. The pilots were reacting well, throwing their aircraft into evasive maneuvers that should have been sufficient against conventional threats. But these weren't conventional threats. The missile systems lighting up her electromagnetic sensors were far more sophisticated than anything in the outdated intelligence reports Burke had relied on. "Bravo Squadron, abort your approach," Carter transmitted. "Repeat, abort approach. Target zone is heavily defended." But Lieutenant Anderson was already committed to his attack vector. Bravo Squadron screaming in from the southwest exactly as briefed. "Negative Alpha Lead. We're 30 seconds from target. We can punch through." Raven watched in horror as Anderson's 4 aircraft flew directly into the engagement zone she'd tried to warn them about. The enemy had clearly planned this ambush with military precision, allowing Alpha Squadron to trigger the initial defenses before revealing the full extent of their capabilities. Bravo Squadron was flying into a gauntlet of overlapping missile systems that had been waiting for exactly this moment. Multiple launches, multiple launches. Anderson's wingman shouted over the radio. "Jesus Christ, where did all this come from?" The answer was in Raven's surveillance data, the electromagnetic analysis she'd compiled over weeks of careful observation. The patterns that showed mobile defensive systems repositioning every few hours. The communication signatures that indicated a sophisticated command and control network. The supply convoy modifications that suggested heavy military equipment being moved into the area. All of it documented in reports that nobody had bothered to read, because they came from a desk pilot whose opinions didn't matter. "Alpha 4 is hit." The transmission came through with background noise that sounded like metal tearing. "I've got multiple system failures and I'm losing altitude fast." Raven switched to the drone camera with the best angle on Alpha 4's position. Captain Rodriguez's A-10 was trailing smoke and debris, its left engine clearly damaged and its flight control surfaces responding sluggishly to his inputs. The aircraft was still flyable, but barely, and it was losing altitude over terrain that offered no safe landing options. "Alpha 4, what's your status?" Carter demanded. "I've got hydraulic failures, electrical problems, and my left engine is completely gone," Rodriguez replied, his voice tight with the kind of controlled fear that came from knowing your aircraft was dying beneath you. "I can maybe make it another 10 minutes if nothing else breaks." 10 minutes. Raven's mind raced through the tactical geometry, calculating distances and flight times. Rodriguez was too far from friendly territory to glide home, too damaged to climb over the mountain ridges that separated him from safety. He needed immediate assistance from aircraft that were currently trapped in the same defensive network that had shot him down. "Bravo leader, I need cover for extraction." Carter transmitted. "Alpha 4 is going down and we need to clear an escape route." "I've got my own problems," Anderson shot back. "Bravo 3 just took a hit and we're dealing with more SAMs than I can count." The situation was deteriorating exactly as Raven had feared it would. The enemy had prepared a layered defense designed to trap attacking aircraft in a kill zone with limited escape routes. The outdated intelligence had walked Alpha and Bravo squadrons directly into a carefully planned ambush, and now multiple aircraft were damaged with pilots in immediate danger. "All stations, this is Overwatch Control," came a new voice from the Main Operations Center. "We're tracking your situation. Search and rescue assets are being scrambled, but they're 40 minutes out." 40 minutes. Rodriguez's aircraft wouldn't survive that long, and the other damaged planes were barely staying airborne as it was. The SAM sites were continuing to engage, their operators clearly trained to maintain pressure on wounded aircraft until they were forced down or destroyed outright. Raven's hands clenched into fists as she watched the tactical disaster unfold. On her screens, everything she'd predicted was happening with deadly precision. The mobile SAM sites were revealing themselves in carefully orchestrated sequence, maintaining overlapping coverage that prevented the A-10s from establishing safe egress routes. The communications intercepts her equipment had detected were coordinating a defensive operation that had clearly been planned for weeks. Alpha 2 is declaring emergency. Came another transmission. I've got fire warnings and I'm losing fuel. Fast. Bravo 4 is down to emergency power and my ejection seat isn't responding. The radio chatter was becoming increasingly desperate as more aircraft reported critical damage. What had started as a routine strike mission was rapidly becoming a rescue operation, with multiple pilots facing the prospect of ejection over hostile territory or riding their damaged aircraft into the ground. Raven stared at her surveillance screens, watching American pilots fight for their lives against enemies she'd tried to warn them about. Her intelligence reports contained detailed analysis of the defensive network, now systematically destroying the aircraft she should have been flying with. Her electromagnetic data had mapped the exact positions of SAM sites that were currently engaging targets she'd trained with and served alongside. She reached for her communication headset, then stopped. Her radio channel wasn't connected to the tactical network. Desk pilots didn't get to participate in combat communications. Her warnings would be filtered through command protocols that would delay them beyond usefulness if they were transmitted at all. On her screen, Alpha 4 continued losing altitude over terrain that would tear apart any aircraft forced to make an emergency landing. Multiple other A-10s were reporting damage that would make the return flight to Kandahar problematic at best. The rescue helicopters were still 35 minutes away from aircraft that might not survive the next 5 minutes, and Captain Raven Sinclair sat in her climate-controlled trailer, watching American pilots die because nobody had listened to the desk pilot who'd seen it coming. The electromagnetic spectrum analyzer continued painting new threats as additional SAM sites revealed themselves. The trap was even more extensive than she'd calculated. A defensive network that had been specifically designed to counter the attack profiles that American pilots had used successfully for months in other sectors. Someone had studied American tactics. Someone had prepared specifically for Operation Crimson Dawn, and someone had built a kill zone that was currently claiming aircraft and pilots with methodical efficiency. All of it documented in surveillance reports that gathered dust. While confident pilots flew into ambush that desk pilots weren't qualified to warn them about. The situation deteriorated with mechanical precision over the next 20 minutes. Raven watched her screens as the enemy's defensive network revealed itself in calculated stages, each new SAM site activation designed to further restrict the escape routes available to the trapped American aircraft. What had begun as a coordinated ambush was evolving into a systematic destruction of 2 entire squadrons. Alpha 4, you need to eject now. Carter's voice carried the strain of a pilot trying to command while dodging missiles. Your aircraft is breaking apart. Captain Rodriguez's response was barely audible through static and engine noise. Negative. Alpha lead. Ejection seat is non-responsive and I'm over hostile territory. I'm going to try to nurse her home. Raven's electromagnetic sensors painted a grim picture of Rodriguez's chances. The damaged A-10 was being tracked by multiple radar systems, its reduced speed and altitude making it an easy target for any SAM operator with patience. More importantly, her terrain analysis showed that the flight path, back to friendly territory, would take him directly over 3 more concealed defensive positions. Bravo 3 is declaring emergency. Lieutenant Thompson's transmission crackled with desperation. I've got hydraulic failure, electrical problems, and my navigation systems are completely dark. I can't find my way out of this valley. The valley. Raven switched to her topographical display, highlighting the terrain features that were becoming death traps for the damaged aircraft. The natural geography that had looked so promising in the mission briefing was now working against the American pilots, channeling their escape routes through predetermined kill zones where patient enemies waited with weapons designed specifically for this moment. All Bravo elements, this is Bravo lead, Anderson transmitted. Form up on me and we'll punch through together. Stay low and follow the riverbed until we clear the ridgeline. Raven's hands moved across her console, pulling up the surveillance data that showed exactly why Anderson's plan wouldn't work. The riverbed he was referencing as an escape route was overlooked by elevated positions that her electromagnetic analysis had identified as SAM sites 2 weeks ago. The enemy had positioned their defenses specifically to cover the obvious terrain routes that trained pilots would instinctively choose. Multiple launches from the eastern ridge. Someone shouted over the radio. SAM's in the air, SAM's in the air. The missiles appeared on Raven's drone feeds as white contrails against the brown landscape, rising from positions she'd marked as probable defensive sites in reports that nobody had read. The mathematical precision of the ambush was horrifying. To watch every American tactical decision anticipated, every escape route covered, every evasive maneuver channeled into new kill zones. Bravo 2 is hit. The transmission was followed by a sound that made Raven's stomach clench, the distinctive whistle of damaged aircraft attempting to maintain flight. I'm losing altitude and my controls are barely responding. Major Foster's voice cut through the chaos from his position with the reserve flight. Command, this is Eagle Flight. We're 20 minutes out and requesting permission to provide close air support for extraction. Negative, Eagle Flight, came the reply from the operations center. Target zone is too hot for additional aircraft. Maintain current position until SAR assets are on station. Too hot. The clinical military terminology didn't capture the reality of what Raven was watching on her screens. Multiple American aircraft were dying over terrain that she'd identified as a trap weeks ago, their pilots fighting for survival against enemies who had prepared specifically for this engagement. The routine strike mission had become a disaster that would cost lives, and aircraft that the Air Force couldn't afford to lose. Alpha 4, your left wing is shedding parts, Carter observed grimly. You're not going to make it home in that aircraft. Rodriguez's reply was barely audible. Then I guess I'll have to get creative. Creative. Raven understood exactly what that meant in pilot terminology. Rodriguez was going to attempt a controlled crash landing in hostile territory rather than ejecting over enemies who would capture or kill him before rescue could arrive. It was a desperate choice that reflected the complete breakdown of the mission's tactical assumptions. Her surveillance equipment picked up new electromagnetic signatures communications traffic that suggested the enemy was coordinating a ground response to capture any pilots who survived their aircraft being shot down. The defensive network wasn't just designed to destroy American aircraft. It was part of a larger operation to capture American aircrews for propaganda or intelligence purposes. Bravo leader, I've got visual on 4 vehicles moving toward Alpha 4's projected crash site, came a transmission from one of Anderson's pilots. Looks like technical vehicles with mounted weapons. The enemy had anticipated even this contingency. Ground forces were already moving to intercept any pilots who managed to survive their aircraft being destroyed. The ambush wasn't just a defensive operation, it was a carefully planned trap designed to capture American personnel for strategic purposes. All stations, be advised that our assets are still 25 minutes out, the operations center reported. Repeat, search and rescue is 25 minutes from target zone. 25 minutes. Raven's tactical analysis suggested that most of the damaged aircraft wouldn't remain airborne that long, and any pilots forced to eject would be captured or killed before rescue could arrive. The enemy had clearly planned this operation with American response times in mind, positioning their forces to exploit the gap between when aircraft would be forced down and when help could arrive. Alpha 2 is declaring emergency. Captain Williams transmitted. I've got fire warnings, hydraulic failure, and my fuel gauge is reading empty. I don't think I can make it back to base. The casualties were mounting with clockwork precision. What had started as damage to 2 Aircraft was spreading through both squadrons as the enemy's defensive network continued engaging targets with methodical efficiency. The sophisticated SAM systems were designed not just to destroy aircraft outright, but to inflict damage that would force pilots to choose between ejection over hostile territory or attempting to fly critically damaged aircraft home. Raven stared at her screens, watching American pilots face impossible choices because nobody had listened to warnings from a desk pilot whose expertise didn't matter. Her surveillance data contained detailed analysis of every defensive position now engaging American aircraft. Her electromagnetic monitoring had tracked the communications networks now coordinating ground forces to capture ejected pilots. All of it documented in reports that had been dismissed as irrelevant because they came from someone who wasn't qualified to participate in tactical planning. The institutional arrogance that had silenced her warnings was now costing lives and aircraft in exactly the ways she'd predicted. "Command, this is Alpha Lead," Carter transmitted, his voice tight with the realization that his mission had become a rescue operation. "We need immediate extraction support for multiple aircraft. The threat level is significantly higher than briefed." Significantly higher than briefed. The careful military language didn't acknowledge that the threat level had been accurately assessed by intelligence sources that Command had chosen to ignore. Raven's reports had painted the exact picture that was now unfolding with deadly precision, but institutional bias had prevented her warnings from reaching the pilots who needed them most. On her screens, multiple aircraft continued fighting for survival against enemies who had prepared specifically for Operation Crimson Dawn, and Captain Raven Sinclair continued watching from her climate-controlled trailer, powerless to help the pilots whose lives hung in the balance because nobody believed that desk pilots had anything valuable to contribute to combat operations. "Command, this is Alpha 4. Rodriguez's voice came through the static with deadly calm. "I'm going down in approximately 3 minutes. Aircraft is no longer controllable, and I can see enemy vehicles moving toward my projected crash site." Raven's fingers flew across her keyboard, pulling up the electromagnetic data that painted the complete tactical picture. The enemy hadn't just prepared an ambush, they'd orchestrated a capture operation. The SAM sites, the mobile ground units, the communications network she'd been monitoring for weeks. It all formed a comprehensive plan to destroy American aircraft and capture American pilots for strategic purposes. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She reached for her communication headset, then stopped. Her radio wasn't connected to the tactical frequency. Desk pilots didn't get to participate in operational communications. Any warning she tried to transmit would have to go through command protocols that would delay it beyond usefulness. By the time her intelligence reached the pilots who needed it, Rodriguez would be on the ground and surrounded by enemy forces. "Alpha Lead, I need immediate cover." Captain Williams transmitted from Alpha 2. "I've got 3 SAM sites painting me, and my aircraft won't climb above 2,000 feet. The SAM sites Williams was reporting were the same ones Raven had identified in her surveillance analysis 3 weeks ago. Mobile launchers that had been repositioning every 6 hours, following patterns that suggested a sophisticated command structure coordinating their movements. She documented their electromagnetic signatures, mapped their likely positions, and predicted exactly how they would be employed against attacking aircraft. All of it sitting in reports that Burke had dismissed as irrelevant because they came from someone who wasn't qualified to make tactical assessments. "Bravo 3, you need to change course immediately," Anderson commanded. "You're flying directly into another missile engagement zone." But Lieutenant Thompson was already committed to his escape route, his damaged aircraft unable to maneuver aggressively enough to avoid the trap that Raven could see developing on her screens. The riverbed Anderson had chosen as an extraction path was overlooked by elevated positions that her analysis had identified as probable SAM sites. The enemy had positioned their defenses specifically to cover the obvious terrain routes that American pilots would instinctively choose when seeking escape from the target area. Multiple launches from the southern ridge. Thompson's transmission was strained with the effort of flying a critically damaged aircraft while dodging missiles. They're everywhere. How did intelligence miss this? Intelligence hadn't missed. Raven's reports had mapped the defensive network with precision that was now proving tragically accurate. The electromagnetic signatures, the communications intercepts, the supply convoy patterns, everything had pointed to a sophisticated defensive operation designed specifically to counter American tactics. But institutional arrogance had prevented her analysis from reaching the tactical planners who could have used it to save lives. She stood up abruptly, her chair rolling backward into the trailer wall. Through her small window, she could see the flight line where her A-10 Warthog 6F fueled and armed, ready for a mission nobody would authorize her to fly. The aircraft she'd flown through hundreds of combat sorties, modified to her preferences and equipped with systems she understood better than anyone else on the base. Staff Sergeant Hayes burst through the trailer door, her face flushed with urgency. "Captain, Colonel Burke wants to see you immediately. Something about emergency intelligence requirements." Emergency intelligence requirements. Now they wanted her expertise after dismissing her warnings for weeks. After sending 2 squadrons into a trap she'd identified and mapped with mathematical precision. After condemning pilots to face enemies whose capabilities she documented in reports that nobody had bothered to read. "What specifically does he need?" Raven asked, though she already knew the answer. "Everything you've got on the defensive positions in Helmand Province," Hayes replied. "Real-time analysis of SAM sites, communications intercepts, anything that might help extract the damaged aircraft." The irony was suffocating. Burke wanted the same intelligence analysis he'd dismissed as irrelevant when it could have prevented the disaster. Now that American pilots were dying, suddenly the desk pilot's expertise was valuable enough to request. Too late to prevent the ambush, but perhaps useful for damage control. "Tell Colonel Burke that my analysis is available in the reports I filed over the past 3 weeks," Raven said carefully. "The same reports that detailed exactly what's happening right now." Hayes shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, I think he needs." It explained in person. "The tactical situation is complicated." Complicated. The military euphemism for a disaster that could have been prevented if anyone had listened to warnings from sources they considered unqualified. Raven's analysis hadn't been complicated. It had been clear, detailed, and accurate. The complication was institutional pride that prevented command, structures from acknowledging expertise that didn't fit their preconceptions. Alpha 4 is going down. Rodriguez's final transmission crackled through the communication system. "I can see the crash. Sight in, there are already vehicles moving in. If anyone's listening, tell my family." The transmission cut to static. Raven stared at her screens, watching the electromagnetic signature of Rodriguez's aircraft disappear from her tracking display. A good pilot, a dedicated officer, a man with a family who would now face capture or death because nobody had listened to intelligence that could have saved his life. The first confirmed loss of Operation Crimson Dawn, but certainly not the last. "Captain?" Hayes prompted gently. "Colonel, Burke is waiting." "I'll be right there," Raven replied, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. She gathered her tablet and intelligence files, the same documents that had been gathering electronic dust while Burke planned a mission based on outdated assumptions. The same analysis that had predicted exactly what was now unfolding with deadly precision. The same warnings that had been dismissed because they came from a desk pilot whose opinions didn't matter in tactical planning. As she walked toward the trailer door, Raven caught sight of her flight suit hanging in the locker. Clean, pressed, and unworn for 8 months. The uniform of a combat pilot who'd been relegated to monitoring screens while other people flew missions into traps she could see coming. Outside, the flight line buzzed with emergency activity as ground crews prepared. Aircraft for rescue operations that might already be too late. Her A-10 sat among the ready aircraft, its engines warm and its weapons systems armed for a mission. She wasn't qualified to fly, but qualification was a bureaucratic concept. Capability was something else entirely. "Hayes," she said quietly, stopping just outside the trailer. "How long until the SAR helicopters reach the target zone?" 18 minutes, ma'am. But they can't go in until the SAM sites are suppressed. 18 minutes. Rodriguez was already on the ground, probably captured or dead. Williams and Thompson were flying aircraft that might not survive another 5 minutes. The rescue helicopters couldn't approach until someone dealt with the defensive network that Raven had mapped with precision weeks ago. Someone who understood the enemy's tactics, their positioning, their communications networks. Someone who'd studied their patterns until she could predict their responses with mathematical accuracy. Someone who'd been flying combat missions when most of the current squadron leaders were still in flight school. Someone who'd been dismissed as a desk pilot because institutional arrogance mattered more than operational effectiveness. Raven looked at her tablet, then at the flight line, then at the communication trailer where Burke was waiting for intelligence he should have requested weeks ago. The same intelligence that could still save lives if delivered by someone with the capability to act on it rather than just report it. For the first time in 8 months, Captain Raven Sinclair began to consider the possibility that being invisible might actually be an advantage. Raven stood outside Colonel Burke's office for exactly 30 seconds, listening to the controlled chaos inside as he coordinated rescue efforts that were already too late. Through the glass partition, she could see him hunched over tactical displays, his face grim as he processed the reality of Operation Crimson Dawn's catastrophic failure. Captain Carter stood beside him, his earlier swagger replaced by the hollow expression of a pilot who'd led his squadron into a massacre. She turned away from the door and walked back toward the flight line, the decision crystallized with mechanical precision as she moved through the base's organized chaos. Ground crews were frantically preparing rescue aircraft while communications specialists coordinated with search and rescue assets that couldn't penetrate the defensive network still operating with lethal efficiency. Everyone was reacting to the crisis, but nobody was addressing its fundamental cause, the sophisticated SAM network that had turned Helmand Province into a kill zone for American aircraft. Staff Sergeant Hayes caught up with her halfway to the flight line. "Captain, where are you going?" "Colonel Burke is waiting for your briefing." "Burke can read my reports," Raven replied without slowing her pace. "They contain everything he needs to know about the tactical situation." "But ma'am," he specifically requested. He specifically dismissed the same intelligence 3 weeks ago when it could have prevented this disaster. Raven interrupted, her voice carrying an edge that made Hayes step back. "Now he wants me to explain why his pilots are dying." The explanation is in 14 separate reports that he chose not to read. Hayes fell silent, recognizing something in Raven's tone that suggested further argument would be futile. They walked together toward the flight line, where Warthog 6 sat among the ready aircraft like a challenge waiting to be accepted. Raven's hands moved with practiced efficiency as she approached her old aircraft. 8 months of desk duty hadn't erased muscle memory developed over thousands of flight hours. She ran her fingers along the A-10's armored hull, checking for obvious maintenance issues while her mind calculated fuel loads, weapons configurations, and flight times to the target zone. "Captain, what are you doing?" Hayes asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Getting ready to fly," Raven replied, opening the external inspection panels to verify system status. "Someone needs to suppress those SAM sites before the rescue helicopters can reach the target zone." "But you're not cleared for I'm not cleared for a lot of things, Raven said, her voice steady and determined, including sitting in a trailer while American pilots die because nobody listened to intelligence reports that could have saved their lives. The pre-flight inspection proceeded with mechanical precision, hydraulic systems, green, electrical systems, green, weapons systems, armed and ready. Warthog 6 had been maintained to combat standards even during her grounding, kept ready for missions she wasn't authorized to fly. The irony wasn't lost on her. The Air Force had maintained her aircraft in perfect condition while declaring her unfit to operate it. Captain Sinclair. The voice belonged to Major Foster, who was approaching at a rapid walk with the kind of purposeful stride that meant trouble. What exactly do you think you're doing? Raven didn't stop her inspection. Getting ready to provide close air support for the rescue operation, sir. You're not authorized for flight operations, Foster said, but his tone lacked conviction. Your medical clearance was revoked after the psychological evaluation. The psychological evaluation that declared me unsuitable for high-stress combat operations, Raven replied, checking the GAU-8 cannon's ammunition feed. Interesting definition of high stress, considering I'm currently watching multiple pilots face capture or death because nobody wanted to listen to a desk pilot's assessment of enemy capabilities. Foster moved closer, lowering his voice. Raven, I understand your frustration, but stealing an aircraft isn't going to solve anything. It'll just end your career permanently. My career ended 8 months ago when a review board decided that. Asking inconvenient questions made me psychologically unstable, she replied, her hands continuing their systematic inspection. Right now, I'm more concerned with saving the careers and lives of pilots who are trapped in a situation I predicted with mathematical precision. The SAR birds are only 15 minutes out, Foster argued. They can handle the extraction once the target zone is secured. Secured by whom? Raven turned to face him directly. Every available combat aircraft is either damaged, low on fuel, or engaged with the same defensive network that's been systematically destroying our people for the past hour. The rescue. Helicopters can't approach until someone deals with the SAM sites, and nobody else seems to understand where those sites are positioned or how they're coordinated. Foster's expression shifted as he processed the tactical reality. The base's available combat aircraft were either involved in the ongoing disaster or being held in reserve for contingencies that command couldn't predict. The sophisticated defensive network had been designed specifically to counter American rescue operations, and conventional approaches had already proven inadequate. You really think you can suppress a network that's defeated 2 full squadrons? He asked quietly. I think I can suppress a network that I've been studying for 3 weeks while everyone else was planning missions based on outdated intelligence. Raven replied, I know where the SAM sites are positioned, how they're coordinated, and what their engagement priorities are likely to be. More importantly, I know how to approach them using tactics they won't expect. She climbed onto Warthog 6's wing and began opening the cockpit canopy. The familiar smell of aviation fuel and hydraulic fluid filled her nostrils, triggering muscle memories that 8 months of desk duty hadn't been able to erase. The cockpit looked exactly as she'd left it, configured to her preferences and equipped with modifications she'd requested during her last deployment. Raven, Foster said, his voice carrying a note of resignation. If you do this, there's no coming back. Burke will have you court-martialed, assuming you survive whatever you're planning. If I don't do this, good pilots are going to die or face capture because institutional arrogance prevented their commanders from listening to intelligence that could have saved them. She replied, settling into the pilot's seat and beginning her startup checklist. I'd rather face a court-martial than live with that responsibility. The A-10's engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, filling the cockpit with vibration that felt like coming home. Systems came online in rapid succession: navigation, communications, weapons control, each indicator confirming that Warthog 6 was ready for the mission she'd been denied permission to fly. "At least tell me your plan," Foster said, raising his voice over the engine noise. Raven looked down at him from the cockpit, her expression calm despite the magnitude of what she was about to attempt. "I'm going to approach the target zone using terrain masking that the SAM sites won't expect, identify their positions using intelligence data that nobody else bothered to read, and eliminate them systematically using tactics designed specifically for their defensive configuration. And if the enemy has more sites than your intelligence detected, then I'll improvise," she replied, beginning to taxi toward the runway. It's what combat pilots do when faced with situations that desk pilots apparently aren't qualified to assess. Foster stepped back as Warthog 6 began moving, its landing gear rumbling against the tarmac. Through her canopy, Raven could see base personnel stopping their activities to watch her unauthorized departure. Some pointed, others reached for radios, but nobody moved to physically block her path to the runway. The control tower's voice crackled through her headset. "Warthog 6, you are not cleared for takeoff. Return to your parking position immediately." Raven switched her radio to the emergency frequency and keyed her microphone. "This is Captain Raven Sinclair, call sign Warthog 6. I am proceeding to provide close air support for Operation Crimson Dawn rescue efforts. My flight plan and tactical assessment are documented in intelligence reports filed over the past 3 weeks." She reached the runway threshold and aligned, her aircraft with the center line, feeling the familiar surge of adrenaline that preceded every combat mission. Behind her, the base erupted into activity as personnel tried to process the reality of an unauthorized takeoff by a pilot who'd been grounded for psychological reasons. But Raven was no longer listening to voices from the ground. Her radio was tuned to the tactical frequency where American pilots were still fighting for survival against enemies she'd been studying for weeks. Where rescue operations were being delayed by defensive networks, she could neutralize using knowledge that nobody else possessed. For the first time in 8 months, Captain Raven Sinclair was about to fly into combat. Not because she had permission, but because she had capability that others lacked in conscience that wouldn't let her watch good pilots die because of institutional failures she couldn't correct from a desk. The throttles moved forward, Warthog 6 accelerated down the runway, and the invisible desk pilot began her transformation into something much more dangerous. The Afghan landscape spread beneath Warthog 6 like a tactical map made real, its brown ridges and valleys holding secrets that Raven had studied through electronic eyes for months. She flew low and fast, using terrain masking techniques that kept her below the radar horizon of the SAM sites she knew were waiting ahead. The A-10's twin engines sang their familiar song, a sound she'd missed more than she'd realized during 8 months of desk duty. Her radio crackled with increasingly desperate transmissions from the ongoing disaster. "Alpha 2, I'm losing hydraulic pressure fast," Captain Williams reported. "I don't think I can maintain control much longer." "Bravo 3, you need to change course immediately," Lieutenant Anderson commanded. "You're flying directly into another missile engagement zone." Raven's tactical display showed the positions of the damaged aircraft, overlaid with the SAM site locations she'd identified through weeks of patient surveillance. The enemy's defensive network formed a nearly perfect kill zone, with overlapping fields of fire that channeled escaping aircraft into predetermined engagement areas. It was a masterpiece of defensive planning, executed by people who clearly understood American tactics better than American commanders understood theirs. "Unknown aircraft, unknown aircraft. This is Overwatch Control," came a transmission directed at her. "You are flying in restricted airspace without authorization. Identify yourself immediately." Raven ignored the radio call, focusing instead on the electromagnetic signatures painting her threat warning system. 3 SAM sites were active ahead, their radar patterns indicating a coordinated tracking system that would engage any aircraft approaching from conventional vectors. But Raven wasn't approaching conventionally. Her route took her through a narrow valley that her terrain analysis had identified as a radar shadow, invisible to the defensive network until she was close enough to engage on her own terms. The first SAM site revealed itself exactly where her intelligence had predicted, its radar dish rotating in a search pattern that covered the obvious approach routes while leaving the valley floor unmonitored. Raven climbed sharply, using the ridgeline as cover until she had a clear firing solution on the mobile launcher, positioned 3 kilometers to the east. Target acquired, she whispered to herself, her weapon systems locking onto the SAM site that had probably contributed to Rodriguez's shootdown. The GAU-8 cannon spun up with its characteristic whine, 30mm rounds, designed to destroy tanks and fortified positions. The first burst lasted 3 seconds and erased the SAM site from existence. Armor-piercing rounds tore through the mobile launcher's protective systems, detonating stored missiles in a fireball that could be seen for kilometers. One down, but the network was already responding, other sites repositioning to cover the gap she'd created. Multiple launches, came a frantic transmission from Bravo Squadron. They're tracking us from positions we can't see. Raven was already moving toward the second SAM site, following a flight path that utilized her intimate knowledge of the terrain to stay invisible until the last possible moment. The enemy operators were good, but they'd planned their defense against CONVENTIONAL American tactics. They hadn't planned for a pilot who'd spent weeks studying their positioning and coordination patterns. Her threat warning system screamed as missiles launched from the second site, but Raven was ready. She'd approached from an angle that forced the SAM operators to engage while she was crossing their radar beam rather than flying directly toward them. The missiles couldn't maintain lock as she disappeared behind another ridgeline, leaving them to detonate harmlessly against rock and sand. The second site died under a concentrated burst from the GAU-8, its radar dish collapsing in sparks and debris. 2 down, but Raven's electromagnetic sensors were painting additional threats: mobile launchers, repositioning to maintain coverage of the escape routes that the damaged American aircraft needed to use. This is Alpha 2. Williams' transmission was strained with the effort of controlling a critically damaged aircraft. I can see the valley exit, but there's another SAM site painting me. The third site. Raven's analysis had placed it on the southern ridge, positioned to engage aircraft attempting to escape through the valley floor. Her approach would have to be different this time. The element of surprise was gone, and the remaining SAM operators would be expecting her. She climbed to attack altitude, making herself visible to the defensive network for the first time since entering enemy territory. Immediately, her threat warning system lit up with multiple missile launches, surface-to-air weapons rising toward her like deadly fireworks. But this was exactly what she'd planned for. The missiles were designed to engage aircraft following predictable flight paths, calculating intercept courses based on standard evasive maneuvers. Raven threw Warthog 6 into a series of aggressive turns that no sensible pilot would attempt in a heavily loaded A-10, using the aircraft's legendary durability to survive G-forces that would have destroyed lighter fighters. The missiles passed beneath her as she dove toward the third SAM site, her cannon already tracking the target. This time, the enemy operators managed to get their system turned toward her, their radar achieving lock just as her rounds began impacting their position. It was a race between their missile launch sequence and her cannon fire, measured in fractions of seconds that would determine whether she survived to continue the mission. The SAM site vanished in an explosion of metal and fire, its final missile launch interrupted by 30mm rounds that shredded the launcher's control systems. 3 sites down, but Raven's work was far from finished. Her electromagnetic sensors were detecting movement throughout the defensive network, mobile units repositioning, communications traffic coordinating new defensive positions, backup systems coming online to replace the destroyed installations. Alpha 2, the valley is clear. She transmitted on the rescue frequency. Proceed to extraction point immediately. Who is this? Williams replied. We weren't briefed on additional air support. This is Warthog 6 providing SAM suppression, Raven answered, already turning toward the fourth target her sensors had identified. Continue your egress and don't look back. She could hear the confusion in Williams' voice, but he followed her instructions, his damaged A-10 limping through the valley she'd cleared with surgical precision. One aircraft saved, but others were still trapped in different sections of the defensive network. Bravo 3. I'm tracking 2 mobile SAM sites moving to intercept your escape route, she transmitted. Alter course 15 degrees south and maintain low altitude until you clear the ridgeline. Unknown calcine, identify yourself, came Anderson's response. We're not authorized to accept tactical guidance from unidentified aircraft. Authorization. Even in the middle of a life or death situation, military protocol demanded proper credentials before accepting help that could save lives. Raven almost laughed at the irony. She'd been fighting the same institutional mindset that had dismissed her warnings and was now preventing her from helping the pilots who needed it most. Bravo 3, you have 30 seconds to change course before those SAMs achieve firing position, she replied calmly. I suggest you worry about authorization after you're out of missile range. Her sensors painted the fourth SAM site moving into position, its mobile platform following roads that her intelligence had mapped weeks ago. The enemy was good, but they were following predictable patterns that someone with enough patience and analytical skill could anticipate. Unfortunately for them, Captain Raven Sinclair had been blessed with both qualities in abundance. The fourth site died under a diving attack that came from an angle its operators hadn't covered. Another burst from the GAU-8 that turned sophisticated defensive equipment into burning wreckage. 4 sites down, defensive network degraded. But the mission was far from over. Her radio crackled with a new transmission, this one from the rescue helicopters that had been standing by outside the engagement zone. Unknown A-10, this is Dustoff. Flight, we're tracking their suppression work and it's opening corridors we couldn't access before. What's your tactical assessment of the remaining threats? Finally, someone asking the right questions. Raven pulled up her electromagnetic display, analyzing the remaining defensive positions that were still active throughout the target zone. The network was damaged but not destroyed, still capable of engaging rescue aircraft if they approached, using conventional flight paths. Dustoff flight, I'm tracking 5 additional mobile sites in your approach corridor, she replied. Give me 10 minutes to clear the path, then approach from bearing 270 at minimum altitude. The ridgeline will mask your approach until you're within range of the survivors. Copy that, Warthog 6. We'll hold position until you give us the all clear. Warthog 6. They'd used her calcine, acknowledging her as a legitimate participant in the rescue operation despite her unauthorized status. For the first time in 8 months, Raven felt like a real pilot again, making tactical decisions that mattered and receiving the respect that competence earned regardless of administrative complications. But the work wasn't finished. 5 more SAM sites needed elimination before the rescue helicopters could safely approach. The crash sites where American pilots waited for extraction. And somewhere in the defensive network, enemy commanders were coordinating countermeasures designed to stop the lone A-10 that was systematically destroying their carefully planned ambush. The 5th SAM site tried to ambush her as she rounded a rocky outcropping, its operators having learned from the destruction of their sister units. Missiles launched without warning, rising from a concealed position that hadn't appeared on any of her electromagnetic surveys. The enemy was adapting, using backup sites that had remained silent during her surveillance period. Raven threw Warthog 6 into a violent turn that stressed the airframe beyond normal operational limits, feeling the A-10's legendary durability as G-forces tried to tear her aircraft apart. The missiles passed close enough that she could see their exhaust trails through her canopy, proximity fuses detonating in bright flashes that sent shrapnel pinging off her armored cockpit. Warthog 6 were tracking multiple missile launches. "In your area," came a concerned transmission from the rescue helicopters. "What's your status?" "Still flying," Raven replied grimly, lining up her cannon on the SAM site that had nearly killed her. "Give me 30 seconds to return the favor." The GA-U-8 spoke with its distinctive roar, 30mm rounds walking across the enemy position, like the footsteps of an angry god. The mobile launcher died in fire and twisted metal, but Raven's electromagnetic sensors were already painting the next threat. 2 more sites moving to flank her position while she was focused on the immediate danger. This was the critical moment she'd anticipated in her tactical planning. The enemy had revealed their reserve positions, committing their remaining mobile assets to stop the aircraft that was destroying their defensive network. It was a calculated risk on their part, expose hidden assets to eliminate the threat, or watch their entire ambush collapse under sustained attack. "Alpha Lead, this is Warthog 6, she transmitted to Carter's frequency. "I need you to coordinate your remaining aircraft for a simultaneous attack on the eastern ridge. I'm painting targets for you now." There was a pause before Carter responded, his voice tight with confusion and something that might have been relief. "Warthog 6, identify yourself. We weren't briefed on additional air support for this operation." "This is Captain Raven Sinclair providing emergency SAM suppression," she replied, already turning toward the 6th target. "I'm transmitting target coordinates for coordinated attack. Execute immediately, or we lose the tactical advantage." Another pause, longer this time. Carter was processing the impossible. The desk pilot who'd been dismissed from mission planning was now coordinating tactical operations from the cockpit of an A-10 that shouldn't have been airborne. The institutional mindset that had silenced her warnings was colliding with operational reality that demanded immediate decisions based on capability rather than authorization. "Copy that, Warthog 6, Carter finally replied. "Alpha elements, form up for coordinated attack. Follow Warthog 6's target designations." The remaining A-10s from Alpha Squadron converged on the eastern ridge where Raven's intelligence had identified the largest concentration of enemy defensive positions. The attack was surgical and devastating, 4 aircraft working in coordination to eliminate SAM sites that had been positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. Each pilot targeted positions that Raven had mapped through weeks of surveillance, using intelligence that had been dismissed as irrelevant by mission planners. "Targets destroyed," Carter reported, his voice carrying a note of professional respect that hadn't been there hours earlier. "SAM activity in the eastern sector has ceased." "Bravo elements, concentrate on the southern approach," Raven commanded, her tactical display showing the remaining threats that needed elimination before rescue operations could proceed. 2 mobile sites moving to block the extraction corridor. Lieutenant Anderson's response came without hesitation. "Copy Warthog 6. Bravo Squadron engaging southern targets." The transformation was remarkable. Pilots who had dismissed her warnings hours earlier were now following her tactical guidance without question, accepting her authority based on demonstrated competence rather than administrative credentials. The institutional barriers that had silenced her voice were dissolving under the pressure of operational necessity. "Dust off flight, this is Warthog 6, she transmitted to the rescue helicopters. "Defensive network is suppressed. You have a clear approach corridor bearing 270. Multiple friendly aircraft require immediate extraction." "Roger, Warthog 6, we're inbound to the crash sites now. Data to first survivor is 3 minutes. 3 minutes. After an hour of watching American pilots fight for survival against enemies she'd tried to warn them about, rescue was finally within reach. The sophisticated defensive network that had seemed impregnable was collapsing under coordinated attack, guided by intelligence that had been available all along. Warthog 6, this is Alpha 4. The voice belonged to Captain Rodriguez, transmitted from a survival radio rather than an aircraft communication system. I'm on the ground with minor injuries. Enemy forces withdrew when they saw the helicopters. Approaching. Don't know how you did it, but thank you. Rodriguez was alive. The pilot whose aircraft she'd watched disappear from her tracking displays had survived the crash and evaded capture. The ground forces that had been moving to intercept him had withdrawn rather than face the rescue helicopters that were now free to operate without fear of SAM engagement. Alpha 2 is safely across the border, Williams reported. Aircraft is flyable but barely. Thanks to whoever cleared that valley, you saved my life. One by one, the surviving aircraft reported successful extraction from the target zone. The pilots who had been trapped by the sophisticated defensive network were now flying home, guided by tactical intelligence that had predicted the ambush and provided the means to defeat it. The institutional failure that had dismissed her warnings was being corrected by operational success that couldn't be denied or explained away. Bravo 3 is clear of the engagement zone, Thompson transmitted. All systems are green, and I'm heading home. That was some impressive flying, Warthog 6. Raven felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal vindication and everything to do with professional competence applied where it mattered most. The pilots she'd watched struggle against impossible odds were now safe, flying damaged aircraft toward friendly territory instead of facing capture or death in hostile terrain. All aircraft, this is Overwatch Control. Came a transmission from the operations center back at Kandahar. Return to base immediately for debriefing. All aircraft acknowledge. Alpha elements acknowledging, Carter replied. Returning to base. Bravo. Elements acknowledging, Anderson added. All aircraft accounted for and heading home. The pause that followed was loaded with implications that everyone understood, but nobody wanted to address directly. Warthog 6 had participated in the rescue operation without authorization, flown combat missions while grounded for psychological reasons, and demonstrated tactical competence that had saved lives and aircraft. Her actions had been necessary and successful, but also completely outside the boundaries of military protocol. Warthog 6, acknowledge return to base. Overwatch Control repeated. Raven looked at her fuel gauge, her ammunition counter, her aircraft systems. Warthog 6 was still combat ready, still capable of engaging targets that threatened American forces. Her unauthorized flight had accomplished its immediate objective clearing, the defensive network that had trapped 2 squadrons of American aircraft, but the larger mission of protecting American forces in the region continued. Overwatch Control. This is Warthog 6, she finally replied. Mission accomplished, returning to base. But as she turned toward Kandahar Airfield, Raven knew that the most difficult part of her mission was still ahead. She would have to land at a base where her unauthorized flight had violated every protocol that governed military aviation. She would face commanders who had dismissed her expertise and might now seek to punish her for proving them wrong. She would return to a system that valued administrative compliance over operational effectiveness. The desk pilot who had been invisible for 8 months was about to become very visible indeed. And the consequences of her transformation from observer to participant would reshape not just her own career, but the way the Air Force thought about expertise, authority, and the institutional barriers that could prevent good intelligence from reaching the people who needed it most. The rescue was complete, but Captain Raven Sinclair's journey was just beginning. The approach to Kandahar Airfield felt different than any landing Raven had made in her career. Warthog 6 descended through clear Afghan sky toward a base that was buzzing with activity she had created, returning from a mission she had never been authorized to fly. The control tower's instructions were crisp and professional, but she could hear the tension beneath the routine phraseology. Warthog 6, you are cleared to land runway 27. Proceed directly to the isolated parking area upon touchdown. Do not taxi to your normal position. Isolated parking. Military terminology for keeping problem aircraft away from normal operations until the situation could be assessed. Raven had expected no less. Her unauthorized flight had violated so many protocols that base security would need to process her return like a potential threat, rather than a returning friendly aircraft. The landing was smooth. Warthog 6's landing. Gear touching down with the solid confidence of an aircraft that had accomplished its mission despite institutional obstacles. As she taxied toward the designated area, Raven could see vehicles converging on her position: security police, maintenance crews, and what appeared to be senior officers and staff cars, marked with flags and command insignia. She shut down the engines and sat in the sudden silence of her cockpit, watching through her canopy as personnel surrounded her aircraft. 8 months of desk duty had ended with a single unauthorized flight that had saved lives and aircraft, but had also challenged every assumption about authority, expertise, and the institutional barriers that determined who was qualified to make life and death decisions. The canopy opened with its familiar hydraulic whine, and Major Foster appeared at the top of the crew ladder. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between professional concern and grudging admiration. Behind him she could see Colonel Burke approaching with the kind of measured stride that suggested he was choosing his words very carefully. "Captain Sinclair," Foster said quietly, "I need you to step down from the aircraft and surrender your sidearm. You're being detained pending investigation of your unauthorized flight. Standard procedure for a military aviator who had violated multiple regulations simultaneously." Raven had expected this moment from the instant she had decided to take off without clearance, but that didn't make it any less surreal. She was being arrested for saving the lives of pilots who had been dismissed her expertise hours earlier. "Understood, sir," she replied, beginning the process of disconnecting her survival gear and gathering her personal equipment. "The aircraft is Code 1, no maintenance issues or combat damage. All systems functioned normally throughout the mission." Foster's eyebrows rose slightly at her professional tone. Even while being detained, she was providing the kind of detailed aircraft status report that demonstrated her priorities remained focused on mission completion rather than personal consequences. Colonel Burke reached the aircraft as Raven descended the crew ladder, his face bearing the expression of a commander dealing with a situation that had no precedent in his experience. Behind him, she could see other personnel gathering: pilots from the squadrons she had helped rescue, ground crews who had watched her unauthorized departure, intelligence officers who were probably trying to understand how a desk pilot had possessed tactical information that saved multiple aircraft. "Captain Sinclair," Burke began, his voice carefully neutral, "you are being detained for unauthorized use of military aircraft, violation of airspace restrictions, engaging in combat operations without clearance, and failure to obey direct orders." He paused, studying her expression. "Do you understand the charges that will be brought against you?" "Yes, sir," Raven replied. "I understand the charges, and I accept full responsibility for my actions." "Then perhaps you can explain why you chose to steal an aircraft and fly an unauthorized mission that could have resulted in your death or capture?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that extended far beyond Raven's individual case. Her answer would determine not just her own fate, but how the Air Force processed the lessons of Operation Crimson Dawn's failure and subsequent rescue. "Sir, I flew an unauthorized mission because authorized personnel were making tactical decisions based on outdated Intelligence while ignoring current analysis that could have prevented the loss of aircraft and personnel. She kept her voice steady and professional. My choice was to watch American pilots die because of institutional failures I couldn't correct through proper channels, or to take direct action using knowledge and capabilities that could save their lives. Burke's expression tightened. Your knowledge and capabilities were deemed insufficient for combat operations by a medical review board that found you psychologically unfit for high-stress situations. The same high-stress situations I successfully navigated for the past hour while conducting combat operations that rescued multiple aircraft and personnel. Raven replied, "With respect, sir, the review board's assessment appears to have been inaccurate." A murmur ran through the gathered personnel. Her words were carefully chosen but unmistakably challenging. She was questioning not just the specific decision to ground her, but the entire institutional process that had valued administrative compliance over operational effectiveness. "Captain." Carter approached the group, still wearing his flight suit and carrying his helmet. His earlier swagger was completely gone, replaced by the sobered expression of a pilot who had come very close to leading his squadron into a massacre. He stopped beside Burke and looked directly at Raven. "Colonel, I need to make a statement regarding Captain Sinclair's actions," he said formally. Burke nodded. "Proceed." "Sir, Captain Sinclair's tactical coordination during the rescue operation was flawless. Her intelligence on enemy defensive positions was completely accurate, and her tactical guidance saved multiple aircraft and personnel." Carter paused, his jaw tightening with what might have been embarrassment. If we had listened to her warnings during mission planning, Operation Crimson Dawn would have succeeded without casualties. Lieutenant Anderson joined the group, adding his voice to Carter's assessment. "Colonel, Captain Sinclair's unauthorized intervention was the only reason Bravo Squadron was able to extract from the target zone. Her knowledge of enemy capabilities exceeded anything in our official intelligence reports." More pilots gathered around the group, their presence creating an uncomfortable dynamic for Burke. The officers he had sent into combat were publicly supporting the desk pilot whose warnings he had dismissed, creating a situation where institutional authority was being challenged by operational results that couldn't be ignored. "Captain Rodriguez is safely at the base hospital, Staff Sergeant," Hayes reported, joining the growing crowd. He specifically requested that his statement include recognition for Warthog 6's role in clearing his extraction route. The testimonials continued as word spread through the base about the day's events. Ground crews who had watched Raven's unauthorized departure, intelligence analysts who had read her reports, maintenance personnel who had kept Warthog 6 combat ready during her grounding. All of them contributing to a narrative that painted her actions as necessary and effective. Regardless of their unauthorized nature, Burke found himself in an impossible position. The pilot he had grounded for psychological reasons had just conducted a successful solo mission that rescued multiple aircraft and personnel. The intelligence reports he had dismissed as irrelevant had proven devastatingly accurate. The institutional processes he had followed had nearly resulted in the catastrophic loss of American lives and equipment. "Captain Sinclair will be held in detention pending a full investigation," he announced finally. "All personnel are to return to their duties immediately." As the crowd began to disperse, Major Foster approached Raven with handcuffs that were standard procedure for detained personnel. She offered her hands without resistance, accepting the physical symbol of her changed status from pilot to prisoner. But as the metal cuffs clicked around her wrists, Raven could see something in the eyes of the personnel watching her arrest. Not condemnation, but respect. Not disapproval, but understanding. The desk pilot who had been invisible for 8 months had become very visible indeed, and her visibility had changed everything. The immediate aftermath of Operation Crimson Dawn was complete, but the larger implications of her actions were just beginning to unfold throughout a military structure that would have to reconcile institutional authority with demonstrated competence. The detention cell at Kandahar Airfield was Spartan but clean, designed for temporary holding rather than long-term imprisonment. Raven sat on the narrow bunk, still wearing her flight suit, watching dust motes dance in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the small barred window. 8 hours had passed since her arrest, and the base outside continued its operations with the kind of controlled efficiency that followed successful missions and avoided disasters. The door opened with a metallic clang, and Major Foster entered carrying a manila folder, thick with documents. His expression was carefully neutral, but Raven could see something in his eyes that hadn't been there during her arrest, a kind of professional respect that transcended rank and regulation. "Captain Sinclair," he said, settling into the metal chair across from her bunk. "I've been asked to conduct a preliminary interview regarding yesterday's events." "Yes, sir," she replied. "I'm prepared to provide a full account of my actions and decisions." Foster opened the folder, revealing what appeared to be dozens of statements, reports, and official documents. "Before we begin, I should inform you that your unauthorized flight has generated significant interest at levels far above this base. Wing Command, Air Force Headquarters, and the Pentagon are all reviewing the circumstances of Operation Crimson Dawn." The Pentagon. Raven had expected serious consequences for her actions, but involvement at the highest levels of military command suggested that her case had implications far beyond a single disciplinary action. "Sir, may I ask about the status of the rescued personnel?" "Captain Rodriguez is recovering well from his injuries. All other aircraft returned safely with minimal damage. The operation is being classified as a success despite the initial tactical difficulties." Foster paused, consulting his notes. "Your unauthorized intervention is being credited with preventing what could have been a catastrophic loss of aircraft and personnel. Being credited." The careful military language suggested that higher command was struggling to process a situation where institutional failure had been corrected by unauthorized action. Her violation of protocol had achieved results that authorized personnel had been unable to accomplish. "Captain, I need you to walk me through your decision-making process," Foster continued. "Help me understand why you chose to act outside the chain of command." Raven had spent the night in detention thinking about exactly this question. Her answer would determine not just her own fate, but how the military processed the lessons of institutional failure and individual initiative. "Sir, I had spent 3 weeks documenting intelligence that indicated Operation Crimson Dawn was flying into a sophisticated ambush. When my warnings were dismissed and the mission proceeded as planned, I was faced with a choice: watch American pilots die because of institutional failures I couldn't correct through proper channels, or take direct action using capabilities that could save their lives." "You're suggesting that proper channels failed?" "I'm stating that proper channels failed, sir. My intelligence reports accurately predicted every aspect of the enemy's defensive network, but they were dismissed because they came from a desk pilot whose expertise was considered irrelevant to tactical planning." Foster made notes as she spoke, his pen moving across official forms that would become part of the permanent record. "Multiple pilots have submitted statements supporting your assessment. Captain Carter specifically noted that your intelligence was more accurate than the official briefing materials. Because I had access to current surveillance data while the official briefing relied on intelligence that was weeks old," Raven replied. "The enemy's defensive network was dynamic, constantly repositioning and improving. Static intelligence couldn't capture those changes." The interview continued for another hour, covering every aspect of her unauthorized flight and the tactical decisions that had led to its success. Foster's questions were thorough but not hostile, suggesting that higher command was genuinely trying to understand how the situation had developed and what lessons should be learned. "One final question, Captain. Foster said as he closed his folder. If faced with the same situation again, would you make the same choice? The question struck to the heart of the entire matter. Would she choose institutional compliance over operational effectiveness? Would she accept the authority of rank over the evidence of competence? Would she watch good pilots die to preserve a system that valued administrative correctness over mission success? Yes, sir, she replied without hesitation. If American lives were at stake and I possessed the knowledge and capability to save them, I would act regardless of authorization. Foster nodded slowly, as if her answer confirmed something he had already suspected. Thank you, Captain. That will be all for now. After he left, Raven returned to watching dust motes in the afternoon. Sunlight. Her fate was now in the hands of commanders who would have to balance her violation of protocol against her demonstrable competence. The institutional machinery that had silenced her voice would now have to process the reality that her unauthorized actions had saved lives, and aircraft. The door opened again, this time admitting Colonel Burke. His expression was significantly different from the morning's arrest, still serious, but lacking the anger that had marked their previous encounters. He carried his own folder, but also something else. Her flight suit jacket, the one that had hung unused in her locker for 8 months. Captain Sinclair, he began, settling into the chair that Foster had vacated. I've received preliminary guidance from Wing Command regarding your case. Raven straightened, preparing for whatever consequences would follow her actions. First, all charges related to your unauthorized flight are being suspended pending completion of a comprehensive review. Burke paused, consulting his documents. Second, your medical clearance for flight operations is being reinstated effective immediately. The words hit her like a physical impact. Reinstated. After 8 months of desk duty, she was being returned to flight status based on her demonstrated competence under pressure. Third, Burke continued, you are being assigned as the primary intelligence liaison for all future operations in this theater. Your expertise in enemy defensive networks is considered essential for mission planning. Essential. The same expertise that had been dismissed as irrelevant was now being recognized as critical for operational success. The institutional barriers that had silenced her voice were being dismantled by the undeniable results of her unauthorized action. Sir, I don't understand, she said carefully. How can the Air Force reinstate someone who violated multiple regulations? Burke's expression softened slightly. Because sometimes the institution is wrong, Captain. And when individual competence corrects institutional failure, the smart response is to learn from the experience rather than punish the person who exposed the problem. He stood and handed her the flight suit jacket, its patches and insignia, exactly as she had left them 8 months earlier. Your new assignment begins tomorrow morning. You'll be working directly with mission planners to ensure that intelligence analysis receives appropriate consideration in tactical decision-making. As Burke left the detention cell, Raven held her flight jacket and processed the magnitude of what had just occurred. The desk pilot who had been invisible for 8 months had not only become visible, she had become essential. Her unauthorized flight had not just saved lives. It had forced an institutional reckoning that recognized expertise over authority, competence over compliance. The transformation was complete, but it was bigger than her individual case. The Air Force was acknowledging that its systems had failed, that proper channels had prevented critical intelligence from reaching decision-makers, that institutional bias had nearly caused a catastrophic loss of aircraft and personnel. Captain Raven Sinclair was no longer fighting for recognition or struggling against institutional barriers. She had moved beyond the need for permission into a space where her expertise was valued, her judgment trusted, and her voice heard by people who made decisions that mattered. The invisible desk pilot had become something much more powerful, a pilot whose competence commanded respect regardless of rank, whose expertise influenced operations regardless of protocol, whose voice carried weight because it had been proven right when institutional authority had been proven wrong. Tomorrow she would return to flight operations, not as someone seeking to prove herself, but as someone whose capabilities had already been demonstrated under the most challenging circumstances possible. 6 months after Operation Crimson Dawn, Captain Raven Sinclair stood in the main briefing room at Kandahar Airfield, but everything had changed. The same faces filled the seats: tactical commanders, intelligence officers, squadron leaders who had once looked through her as if she were invisible. But now their attention was focused entirely on her as she presented the intelligence assessment that would guide the next major operation in the theater. Enemy defensive networks have evolved significantly since Crimson Dawn, she said, using a laser pointer to highlight positions on the main tactical display. They've learned from our success and adapted their positioning to counter the approaches we used in Helmand Province. The room was silent except for the quiet scratch of pens on notepads as experienced combat pilots took notes on her analysis. Colonel Burke sat in the front row, no longer the dismissive commander who had once relegated her to irrelevant desk duty. He listened with the focused attention of someone who had learned the cost of ignoring expert analysis. The key vulnerability is here, Raven continued, highlighting a section of terrain that appeared unremarkable to untrained eyes. Their communications network relies on line-of-sight relay stations positioned on elevated terrain. If we can eliminate this central node, their entire defensive coordination collapses. Captain Carter raised his hand, the same pilot who had once called her desk pilot, with mocking condescension. Captain Sinclair, what's your assessment of the approach vectors that would minimize exposure to their SAN network? The question was delivered with professional respect, acknowledgement of expertise that had been earned through demonstrated competence rather than administrative credentials. Carter's squadron had been one of those saved by her unauthorized intervention, and that experience had permanently altered his perspective on the value of intelligence analysis. 3 viable approaches, Raven replied, clicking to the next slide. The terrain masking here allows penetration of their outer defensive ring without triggering early warning systems. But timing is critical. The mobile launchers reposition every 4 hours based on patterns I've been tracking. Lieutenant Anderson, now promoted to captain, leaned forward with genuine interest. How confident are you in those movement patterns? Highly confident, she answered. I've been monitoring their electromagnetic signatures for 8 weeks. They're following predictable cycles that suggest central coordination rather than tactical flexibility. The briefing continued for another 30 minutes, with detailed questions that reflected the new reality of intelligence-driven mission planning. Her analysis wasn't being dismissed or marginalized. It was driving tactical decisions at the highest levels of operational command. The invisible desk pilot had become the primary voice in determining how American forces would engage the enemy. After the formal briefing ended, Major Foster approached her at the podium. His weathered face carried the expression of someone who had witnessed a fundamental transformation in how the Air Force conducted operations. Outstanding work, Raven, he said, using her first name in a way that acknowledged their relationship had evolved beyond strict military formality. Your recommendations are being forwarded to Wing Command for incorporation into the overall theater strategy. Theater strategy. Her intelligence analysis was now influencing operations across the entire region, guiding decisions that affected thousands of personnel and billions of dollars in equipment. The expertise that had once been relegated to surveillance reports that nobody read was now shaping American military strategy in one of the world's most challenging operational environments. Sir, I've been thinking about the training implications, she said, gathering her briefing materials. We need to develop better integration between intelligence analysis and tactical planning. Too many pilots still don't understand how to read electromagnetic signatures or interpret enemy communications patterns. Foster nodded thoughtfully. What are you proposing? A comprehensive training program that teaches combat pilots to analyze intelligence data themselves rather than relying entirely on separate intelligence briefings, Raven replied. If we'd had that kind of integration before Crimson Dawn, the initial mission would have succeeded without casualties. The suggestion represented a fundamental shift in how the Air Force thought about the relationship between intelligence and operations. Instead of treating them as separate functions, Raven was proposing integration that would give every pilot the analytical skills she had developed through years of patient observation and study. I'll discuss it with Wing Command, Foster said. They're very interested in lessons learned from your unique perspective on operations. As Foster walked away, Raven found herself alone in the briefing room where she had once stood invisible. Against the back wall, holding a tablet full of analysis that nobody wanted to hear. The same tactical displays showed similar terrain, similar threats, similar challenges. But everything else had changed. The door opened, and Colonel Burke entered, carrying a folder marked with classified designations. His expression was serious but not hostile, the look of a commander dealing with important operational matters rather than disciplinary problems. Captain Sinclair, he said formally, I have new orders for you. She straightened, wondering what assignment would follow her transformation from desk pilot to essential operational asset. You're being transferred to the Pentagon, Burke continued, opening the folder to reveal official transfer documents. Air Force Headquarters wants you to develop a new doctrine for intelligence operations integration. Your experience with Operation Crimson Dawn has generated significant interest in how we can better utilize analytical expertise in tactical planning. The Pentagon, the highest levels of Air Force Command, wanted her to help reshape how the entire service thought about the relationship between intelligence and operations. Her unauthorized flight had not just saved individual pilots, it had exposed institutional weaknesses that needed systematic correction. Sir, what specifically would my responsibilities include? Developing training curricula that teach operational pilots to conduct their own intelligence analysis. Creating protocols for real-time intelligence integration during combat operations. Reviewing existing procedures to identify institutional barriers that prevent expert analysis from reaching decision-makers. Burke paused, his expression softening slightly. Essentially, making sure that what happened to you never happens to another qualified professional. The assignment represented everything she had hoped to achieve through years of patient work and careful analysis. Not just personal recognition, but institutional change that would improve how the Air Force conducted operations and protected its personnel. Her voice wouldn't just be heard, it would help shape the voices of future generations of military aviators. When do I report, sir? 2 weeks, Burke replied. That gives you time to complete the current operational cycle and brief your replacement. He handed her the transfer orders, then paused. Captain, I owe you an apology. Your expertise should have been valued from the beginning, and my failure to recognize that nearly cost lives that your unauthorized action ultimately saved. The apology was more than personal. It represented institutional acknowledgement that expertise mattered more than administrative convenience, that competence deserved respect regardless of its source, that the military strength came from the knowledge and dedication of its people rather than the rigidity of its hierarchies. Thank you, sir, she replied. But the real lesson isn't about individual recognition. It's about creating systems that value competence over compliance, that listen to expertise regardless of its source, that prioritize mission success over institutional comfort. As Burke left the briefing room, Raven remained behind, looking at the tactical displays that had once shown threats she wasn't allowed to address. Tomorrow, she would brief another mission, guide another operation, contribute to another success. Built on intelligence that was finally being heard by people who could act on it. The invisible desk pilot had completed her transformation into something the Air Force had never seen before, A pilot whose expertise bridged the gap between intelligence and operations, whose voice carried weight at the highest levels of command, whose experience would help prevent future institutional failures that could cost lives and equipment. Captain Raven Sinclair was no longer fighting for recognition or struggling against barriers that kept her expertise from reaching people who needed it. She had moved beyond individual success into institutional change, beyond personal vindication into systematic improvement. Somewhere in the world, another impossible problem was waiting for someone with the knowledge to understand it, the courage to act on that understanding, and the determination to ensure that expertise was heard by people who could use it to save lives. And thanks to the invisible desk pilot who had become visible when it mattered most, the Air Force was finally ready to listen. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.